next two videos, we're going to look at ways in which different groups of researchers have thought about the way that we know the world and how our knowledge is organized. Those are not well-defined questions, and people coming from different areas with different specializations will think about these in different ways. So we're going to first look at how the discipline of psychology has long considered knowledge representation. And then in the next video, we'll look at how that changes drastically when computer scientists get in on the act. So first of all, psychologists, in thinking about how we know the world, have long had an interest in what are called categories. The fact that we see something and we say, that's a dog, that's a pot, that's a snake, shows that in interpreting the world, we have certain terms which are quite general terms and which include a whole bunch of individual exemplars. The ancient Greeks thought hard about this, and indeed the notion of a category, the idea that the way that we understand the world is built, it comes in with these sort of containers, goes back to Aristotle. Aristotle's view of categories was very simplistic by our standards, and we wouldn't subscribe to it, but it was very, very influential. And so the way Aristotle went about thinking about this was, if I identify something as a chair, then it must have some features that make it a chair, and any given thing has so many features. In order for it to count as a chair, he distinguished between what are called necessary features and sufficient features. And this influenced Western thought for 1500 years. It turns out not to be terribly useful. So when you try to define the necessary and sufficient features for something, it works reasonably well in some cases, but if you push it at all, it breaks very quickly. So supposing we want to say, what's a bird? Well, there's lots of features of birds, there's lots of individual birds, and they all differ, but what do they have in common? Well, you might think that to be a bird is to be an animal with feathers that flies, for example. Let's see, did we capture all birds there? No, we didn't, because some birds don't fly. To be egg layers? No. Maybe if you have feathers, well, flying is a problem, isn't it? Because some birds don't fly. You see, the thing about any real category is that they tend to be much messier than this simple idea. There were always some examples that were trotted out here that seemed to work very well, but even they, of late, have been rather unstable. So, for example, a good example of a category which seemed to have necessary and sufficient conditions was the Pope, the head of the Roman Catholic Church, because if you were the head of the Roman Catholic Church, you were the Pope, and that was it. Currently, there's two popes, so that category got complicated. It was turned out to be more complicated than expected. Even things that seem very, very solid and reliable can change. So, for example, the planets, stars and planets are where we look for those things that just don't change. And yet a group of astronomers recently decided that Pluto was no longer a planet, it was something else. So the idea that things simply belong to categories by virtue of features that they have, that just didn't hold up, and it went away about 500 years ago. Of course, we still categorize things, but what's become clear now is that the way in which we divide up the world and call this a dog and this a cat, for example, is not because the world naturally comes with these categories, but because of how we've learned in a specific culture among specific people to get by, and we find it useful to divide the world up one way or another. A very important book in this comes from George Lakoff with the wonderful title Women, Fire and Dangerous Things. And in it, they tease out this question a great deal because the fact that we divide the world up into categories and that we label things as cats and dogs is fairly obvious. Most of the words that we use don't pick out individuals like Fido, but they pick out a category like dog. And these categories seem to underlie all our thoughts, perceptions, action, and speech. So their categories are fundamental to how we approach the world. Even just recognizing something as something seems to be an act of categorization. But it is completely culture bound. These are not, our categories are not simply the way the world is. And Lakoff gives a very insightful example using categories which, to speakers of Dyirbal, which is an Australian Aboriginal language, these categories are clear. And to you, these categories will not be clear. So the category of Bai includes men, kangaroos, possums, bats, most snakes, most fishes, some birds, most insects, moons, storms, rainbows, boomerangs, and some spears. Whereas you would never confuse Bai with Balan. Balan includes women, bandicoots, dogs, platypuses, echidna. You see what's happening here? These categories don't divide up the world in meaningful ways for us who are not speakers of Dyirbal. But if you are of that people, it's not just a matter of using the right words. If you are from that particular culture, if you are among that people and you interpret the world in that way, these are perfectly salient categories. So categories are not natural kinds. The world doesn't come divided into categories. We can see this on ourselves. One category we use is chair. We say that's a chair, that's not a chair, that's a chair, and that's a table. So chair is a perfectly good category, and there's 4 chairs. But I think if you look at these 4 chairs, you'll agree that some of them are, in some respect, better chairs than others. So the 2 in the middle are pretty good chairs. But the one on the left is a chair which is exclusively reserved for killing people. That's an electric chair. That's a kind of an unusual chair, isn't it? It's not being built for execution, is not the central part of what it is to be a chair. The one on the right looks a bit different from the 2 in the middle. And that's a chair reserved for a lifeguard. So chairs come in various kinds with various purposes. They're not all the same thing, and it would prove to be very difficult to say exactly what it is to be a chair. A stool, you might say, is not a chair. What if we put a little bit of a back on it? How high does the back have to be? Categories are a bit fluid like this. So when we encounter something and we give it a name, we're drawing on our past experience. And the way psychologists have thought about this is to suggest that when we meet something new, we compare it, as it were, to things we've seen in the past. And there's 2 basic ways we could do this. On the right, if we encounter something and we've met very few of them before. So supposing mammoths are brought back to life and you meet a mammoth and it's the first mammoth you've ever met in your life. That mammoth's going to stick with you. And then you meet another one and you go, oh yeah, that's another mammoth. Oh, it's different color, but yeah, it's very like that. So you're comparing one thing with another thing. But you've seen lots of horses. And when you meet a horse, you don't go, oh yeah, this horse is just like that horse. Rather, the horse seems to partake of horseness, as it were. It seems to be a good or, more central exemplar of the notion of horse. So when you compare something to a specific example, we call that an exemplar. And this seems to be the way that we get a grasp on the world as we're learning a category, because we learn new categories all the time. But obviously, as you encounter more and more of a new category, the category itself takes on a life of its own. And so the prototype idea suggests that after you've had a lot of experience with mammoths or elephants or something, that when you meet a new one, you're not comparing it to every one you've met before, but sort of to the center of gravity of that concept, sort of to horseness or elephantness. That's a prototype. So the idea here is that prototypes are abstractions based on prior experience. And the good thing about having categories which are have prototypes is that you don't need to remember every single horse that you ever met in order to interpret and recognize a new horse as a horse. So in terms of storage, this is relatively cheap. Exemplars are going to be useful when a concept is being bootstrapped, as it were, when you've just met the first wumpus of your life, and now you meet another wumpus, and you go, that's like that wumpus, and you meet a third wumpus, and now you meet something and you're not sure, is it a wumpus? You're comparing the new thing to individuals. So that's clearly going to require you keeping other individuals around in memory, as it were. So it's an expensive way to bootstrap a category, and presumably is more important when we're learning new categories. Psychologists looking into this have also noticed that categories seem to have kind of an organization, and that we might identify tentatively a basic level of category. These are words that seem so unproblematic to us, words like chair and football and so on. But each of those categories then can be both generalized and can be specialized. So we might generalize chair to furniture, for example, which is a bigger category that includes chairs. And we might make specializations of the category, like electric chair or office chair. At the basic level, categories tend to be easily visualized. They're the kind of things that you keep maximally distinct. So it's much easier to think of a chair than it is to think of a piece of furniture, because there's so many choices with a piece of furniture, right? Now, there's actually many choices with chairs as well. But if I say, oh, I bought a piece of furniture, you're not really well informed. Whereas if I say I bought a chair, you kind of are. So at the basic level, categories seem to maximize similarity among their members, and minimize the similarities across contrasting categories. So a chair and a table. I'm sure you could come up with a hybrid chair table, a table with a chair built in. But at the basic level, a chair is distinct from a table. So just consider these activities. If we're out walking in UCD and we see a bunch of people over there and I say, oh, look, they're playing football, that'll be a fairly normal kind of thing to say. But if I quite correctly say, oh, look, there's a group of people engaged in an activity, that would be a bit funny, wouldn't it? I'd have kind of underspecified things. And we're out walking and we have no particular connection to the football world, and we say, oh, look, there's a boys under 15 football. That's very specific and suggests a degree of specificity that might be unusual. Likewise, as we said, table is easy to imagine. It's a central kind of category. We can specialize it to dressing table. If I go out and say I bought a piece of furniture, or I bought an object, because that's the supreme uber category, object, thing, I've left you without a lot of information. But notice that your familiarity with a particular field will determine what for you is a basic level category. So for me, for example, I'm not real good with birds. There's white birds and brown birds and black birds and funny looking birds. But if you're an ornithologist, then bird is a bit like furniture. It's too general. And for you as an ornithologist, something like gull might be a basic level category. So categories don't describe the way the world is. They describe the way that we divide up the world ourselves. So that's where psychologists got to thinking about categories. And in the next video, we're going to move on and look at how computer scientists have tackled this within the domain of artificial intelligence.